questions about the Hadith, the Sunnah, Sharia. All right, let's then talk briefly in the time that we have left about some things related to Islamic architecture and art. One of the key things, of course, with Islamic architecture would be the mosque. The term mosque comes from the Arabic word masjid, which means kneeling place. Right? And so a lot of the focus of the mosque has been on prayer. And in mosques, of course, there is a huge space for prayer. In modern times, and especially in Western countries, many mosques also function as community centers, places for Muslims to come, as well as education. So if people are interested in just kind of learning about Islam, not converting, but just, especially after 9/11, a lot of people wanted to learn more about Islam, so they might have an educational type of setting. In other countries and in the past, they would serve as treasuries, they would serve as law courts, but a lot of those functions have moved from the mosque even in Muslim-majority countries. There are four essential elements of, this is the Taipei Mosque in Pakistan, and this is the mosque in Dearborn, Michigan. Michigan has a really sizable group of Muslims. As Muslims immigrated, especially toward the latter part of the 19th century, a lot of them immigrated to the Midwest because that's where there were a lot of jobs. So that's why there's a sizable group of Muslims in some place like Michigan, which you might not necessarily think of if you did that. Kind of with this as well, before we move to the four essentials, you see, of course, some similarities here, right? These long towers known as minarets. Many mosques will also feature domes. And so there are some things that are kind of what we call full-blown mosques, right? You can look at it and say that's a mosque. But in the West, there have been other expressions of this. In some places, you might find just a domed building. They might not have the towers. Some of that has to do with not so much different types of architecture as it is by communal ordinances, right? Communities saying we don't want a mosque here, and so you can't put minarets up and those kind of things. And so you have architecture like that. In the West as well, you might also find storefront mosques, right? And in kind of abandoned strip malls where they just kind of, you wouldn't know it was a mosque until you get up to the door and saw the prayer times on Friday or whatever. And so in the West, you see a variety of architectural expressions. But for it to be a mosque, there must be four essential characteristics, four things present. One of which is a fountain. Before entering the mosque, you're to ritually wash your hands and feet. Entering, services are segregated by gender. The men toward the front, the women toward the back, or maybe in some places separate rooms. Women as well also expected to cover their heads in going in. You take off your shoes as well entering the mosque. As mentioned before, large place for prayer. Not all prayer done in a mosque, but Fridays especially, a lot of Muslims will gather in the mosque for prayer. Usually there's also what's known as a minbar or a pulpit, right, a place where the imam might give a sermon on Friday. And then the mihrab. The mihrab is kind of a cutout in the wall that tells you which direction to pray, right? The Mecca is that way. Mosques, of course, as I mentioned already, faced a lot of challenges, especially after 9/11. There was a sudden decrease in the number of mosques built. A lot of Muslims using that money to try and educate people about Islam. And some of the stories that come out of some of these controversies are really quite, well, they're funny on one hand because of how absurd they are. So a couple of years ago, there was this big controversy over a mosque being built close to Ground Zero in New York. And so there was great concern, right? You know, this Muslims were responsible for the towers coming down. How could this happen? But it wasn't a mosque. It was actually just a community center, for one thing, an Islamic center. But the other thing is that 2 blocks further was a mosque that had been there for 40 years. That nobody knew about because, but it was there and it was practicing and Muslims had been going, right? So it had been, actually where they were wanting to go was like an abandoned Burlington coat factory, and how holy Burlington coat factory is. There was one in Texas that was interesting as well. Plans are to build up this mosque, and this farmer bought up the land surrounding the mosque, saying he's going to run pig races on Fridays. Because the pig, pork, you can't eat pork. And so the news people said, what do you think about that? Go ahead, we have no problems against pig races, we just don't eat them. Right? So here was this guy trying to, make fun of Muslims or whatever, and the Muslims were whatever, But it's, at some point, some of these controversies, it's horrible in one sense. I think that, some of the things that are said, and the irony, but on the other hand, it's kind of funny because it's ignorant of a variety of things when it comes to Islam.
I think it's also a little funny that a lot of the terrorists that bomb themselves and stuff, some of the content in the bombs that they use come from pigs. So they're blowing themselves up with pigs.
Yeah, there's so much irony here, and of course, most Muslims would reject that and say that's not what Islam is about. Mosques, of course, do provide us with some rather interesting-looking architecture. Some, I think, we might call beautiful from an architectural standpoint, even if we might not, as Christians, be supportive of Islam as a religious approach. One of the most famous ones, of course, is the Dome of the Rock. Artistic representation, as we talked about before, the western wall, the railing wall here. Dome of the Rock. There's also the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Is on the Dome of the Rock, or on the Temple Mount. Well, it used to be the Temple Mount there. Tradition for some Jews is that this was the place where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac. The rock of the Dome of the Rock is believed to have been part of Solomon's temple. We'll say more about that in a minute. Picture of the Jerusalem skyline at night. Look inside. All the Quran's verses about Jesus are found in calligraphy in the Dome of the Rock. Right? So there's a rather interesting part there. Here is the rock of the Dome of the Rock. Right? So like I said, believed to have been the place where Abraham was prepared to sacrifice. May have been part of Solomon's temple, or the foundation for Solomon's temple. When we talked about Muhammad's night journey and his ascension to heaven that was supposed to take place during his early life, it's believed that he ascended from this rock into heaven. It's also a tradition that at the end of the world, the angel that announces the day of judgment will stand on this rock proclaiming the last judgment. I'm not really positive about that. I think that there's some restriction of how close you can get.
Like they had a wall around it.
Right. People back here kind of gives you an idea of the size of the wall. But I'm not really sure. My guess is you wouldn't be able to touch it or anything like that. Another famous looking mosque is what's known as the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. Again, the minarets, the domes, in this case, this kind of cascading series of domes. Look at the Blue Mosque inside. Also has some kind of museum qualities today. A lot of people visit there as a tourist stop. The Blue Mosque, known for this blue color predominating throughout the mosque. French visitors in the 17th century, I believe, called these blue tiles the color of the Turks, or turquoise. So that's where we get the term turquoise. It was built in the 16th century after Muslims had taken over Istanbul, what was then Constantinople, and was built near the Hagia Sophia Church, the Church of Holy Wisdom. I had some other pictures that they look almost exactly the same, because Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, minarets were built, and so on the Istanbul skyline you can see they look almost exactly the same. Another prominent mosque, the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, has expanded since the 7th century. And this is the first mosque built when Muhammad escapes to Medina. An open-air building that has been expanded several times, and of course, did not look like that in its very humble beginnings in the 7th century. It's been enlarged, embellished. Some people believe there is Muhammad's tomb is there. Right? There's this area that's believed to be Muhammad's tomb. Other people claim that it is at a different site. Another shot of the Mosque of the Prophet. Many people, when they go to Mecca for the Hajj, will then also travel to Medina and visit the Mosque of the Prophet as well. Then there is the Great Mosque in Mecca. Remember, these are all people. It too has been expanded over the time. Millions of people will gather for the Hajj. The Kaaba, of course, is very important. I'll say this, and it's one of those kind of obvious statements once you think about it, but it's not obvious. I mean, it's not something you immediately think of. This is the only mosque in the world that does not have a directional marker. Pray towards the Kaaba, there it is, right? You don't even know which direction you should pray because it's right there. And so that's one distinction between that and some of the other mosques. And of course, as more and more Muslims travel for the Hajj, it does continue to be expanded. Another shot of the mosque, specifically of the Kaaba. This is a cloth that's covering the box. And of course, every so often it does tear, it needs repairing. There is a specific family that is kind of responsible for sewing the cloth that covers the Kaaba. Let's talk briefly, again, as we finish up here today, about art. As I mentioned before, a lot of Muslim art does not depict human beings. So you don't find too much artwork in general of people, any people, let alone famous people, and we talked about some of the issues with Muhammad. So what you do find is a lot of use of calligraphy, and decorative use of scripts, texts. Many people that produce calligraphy will usually use passages from the Quran. This one here is Bismillah, which is the opening of each of the surahs of the Quran, which says, "In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." So, decorative script is one. Also prominent in Islamic art are geometrical designs. Circles or triangles, squares, hexagons. Usually these very ornate patterns, many of which interlock or connected somehow. Often for a lot of people expressing the kind of the unity of the Islamic world vision. Also prominent in many places would be things like floral designs. Especially in Iran, a lot of floral designs. This one here, you might not be able to make it out, includes some calligraphy, right? So you can have these kind of mix and match of artistic design. Kind of believed to evoke God's beauty or the beauty of the divine through nature. There is for a lot of people, this symbolic connection between certain types of flowers and certain types of prophets or certain prophetic traditions. Muhammad is connected with the rose. And so people will have pictures of roses in their house. will have roses in their house, and so Muhammad usually connected with the rose. There's a prophetic tradition that all the world's roses were white until Muhammad ascended to heaven. And when the divine roses beheld Muhammad, they blushed. Right? And so that's why you end up with red and pink roses. And so, again, rather interesting approach. Questions about anything related to Islamic art or architecture or mosques? All right, let's go ahead and close there. On Thursday, we'll talk about Islamic fundamentalism, relationships between Islam and the West, maybe even getting into some of the things about Islam in the United States.